So last time we looked at the benefits, the good things which came out of the church in the medieval period in Scotland. And it's like a coin, the good side on the things that we've just looked at last week, and now we're going to look, sadly, at the more negative side, the corruption that came into the church in the Middle Ages. And so one of the things that happened was that the church itself became so popular by the 4th century onwards, and with the destruction of the Roman Empire and it disintegrated, people were kind of fighting each other for influence and power. And while the kings were fighting over over territory, that there needed to be some sort of order. So bishops were asked to lead, and they became sort of political statesmen, religious leaders. And because of that, they came also with it wealth and influence and power. A lot of good happened, but with the power there came corruption. And this is what we're going to look at in this particular part of the series. The causes of the corruption in the church, as I've already mentioned, were wealth and power and popularity, but also the fact that the Emperor Constantine came in and was a great support to the church. He did many good things, but we begin to find a mixing together of church and state, which in some ways can be good, but also it can lead to other things which are not so good as well. Constantine became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire after defeating his pagan opponent Licinius in 324 AD. And he backed the church. He claimed to have become a Christian. And so what we found is that Christianity moved from a despised minority that was growing, still multiplying though, through persecution, a purified church, and suddenly it's come out of the shadows right into the limelight with the backing of the most powerful person on the planet at that time. So Constantine rewarded the church. Eusebius, who was a church historian and wrote the history of the church of the first 3 centuries, he noted that cathedrals were again rising from their foundations high into the air. And he says a stream of personal letters from the emperor reached the bishops, accompanied by honours and gifts of money. The basilica itself he built solidly of still richer materials in abundance, never for a moment counting the cost. He furnished it with thrones high up to accord with the dignity of the prelates or the bishops. So this wealth and this honour given to bishops would actually be the seed eventually of the church's self-destruction. Constantine himself called for the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and he stepped in on the church's behalf with his edict against the Arians. A letter was written of Constantine to the church, and it said there, if someone should be discovered to have hidden a writing composed by Arius and not to have immediately brought it forward and destroyed it by fire, his penalty shall be death. So in other words, if you didn't accept Jesus as God, if you accept him as having a beginning, and you had books and you refused to let go of them, you could be executed. So what we see from this time forward is the execution of the heretics and eventually the burning of heretics, which was never at all allowed in the scriptures of the New Testament. So this was a very important part of the decay that happened in the church from this period of Constantine onwards. So it would actually lead to the terrible carnage we see, for example, when eventually reformers would rise up to confront the church about its corruption, and many of them were burnt at the stake for challenging certain things which had crept into the church which were not biblical. In fact, it got so bad in the 16th century that it was on a par with what the Roman pagans were doing to the Christians in the way that they tortured and killed so many Christians. We see the same kind of thing going on in that same period which led to the Reformation. Eusebius, that church historian, he actually bemoaned the rapid growth of the church. You'd think, oh, well, we want to see rapid church growth. But he said, yeah, it's great to have good church growth as long as it's healthy. But he said it was the expense of holiness. He said, but our increasing freedom transformed our character to arrogance and sloth and unspeakable hypocrisy. And that was an issue that we had to deal with as it grew. I've mentioned about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Firstly, in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Goths sacked Rome. And this was followed quite soon afterwards in 476 AD, when the Roman Empire was crumbling to pieces after the second time that Rome was sacked. So as rival kings fought over territory, the church began to rise up in power with the bishops. What we find is decadence starts to really come into the church, and now we're going into Scotland. The same thing that was happening in Europe was also happening in Britain. There's a man called Gildas, and scholars reckon that he was a monk from the area of Strathclyde near Glasgow. And in his book, The Ruin of Britain, he bemoans the corruption that happened in the church in the 6th century. He's writing in about 540s AD. And he says, priests Britain has, but foolish ones. A great number of ministers, but shameless. They have church edifices, but enter them for the sake of filthy lucre or for money. Truth they hate as an enemy, and favour lies as if they were their dearest brothers. Many of these men, after a wicked life, rather force their way into the priesthood, or buy it at almost any price. After gaining the priestly chair of the episcopate, being bishops, or the presbytate, which means being presbyters or elders, they meanly wallow like swine. They buy counterfeit and unprofitable priesthood from tyrants and from their father, the devil. So he's a monk, he's a Christian monk, and he's bemoaning what's happening in that 6th century in Scotland amongst the Britons, all the way down through England, through Wales, and through southern part of Scotland. And it's a terrible, corrupt time. And there was such a need for people like Kentigern to rise up and preach the gospel and call the people back from corruption. So when we move a bit further on, the church decadence in medieval Scotland gets worse. Along with the corruption came ignorance and disregard of the authority of Scripture. Bishops and abbots ruled like princes, and the priests struggled to survive, so they had to find other work to pay their bills. Other priests who were recruited were almost illiterate. The Archbishop of St. Andrews complained that they hardly knew their alphabet, so that's a pretty disastrous situation. Furthermore, the accounts of the immorality of the priests were not Protestant propaganda. The Roman Catholic Church itself records this period and testifies to the hundreds of illegitimate children fathered by the clergy. One Jesuit reported to his superior that the priests and clergy in Scotland are extremely licentious and scandalous. Well, the later reformers have often been accused of tearing down churches in a sort of frenzied, fanatical rage as they sought to eradicate corruption and pagan idolatry which had come into the church. But the reality is actually less exciting. Most of the parish churches were failing and were falling down through neglect and lack of finance, or through being burnt through wars which happened in the medieval period. And all the while the bishops and the cardinals and the abbots were becoming richer and richer, and through the wealth of the church. Aristocratic families tended to put their children in places of power in the church as abbots and bishops. King James IV of Scotland, for example, whilst he was building his Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh in 1504, he nominated his illegitimate son Alexander, aged only 11, to the position of Archbishop of St. Andrews. Christianity was far from the minds of those appointed into those positions. Pope Clement VII agreed to King James V to put the three wealthiest abbeys in the hands of his three illegitimate sons. So when Sir David Lindsay wrote a satire of the three estates in 1540, which was levelled against the corrupt clergy, the lords and the burgesses, and the merchants, his descriptions were unfortunately accurate and damning for the church, and all of the abuses he wrote about. can be confirmed by church records. The cathedrals and the abbeys might have looked artistically beautiful, but inside it seemed that they were full of rotting corpses of what was going on, the decadence of the church. So it was a sad time in our church history, and there was, of course, a remnant. There always has been a remnant of godly people who tried their best to live godly lives, to obey Christ, to do what was right, but their voice largely was drowned by the authority and the power of the aristocratic people who'd wormed their way into the church. And even the monastic orders I spoke about that were doing so many good things, they were taken over by the aristocracy and the nobles because they were interested in the wealth that went with it rather than true spirituality. Well, what we find is, in this period, we start to see also strange teachings coming into the church, mixed up with the Christian teaching. We find, for example, the praying to dead saints and the praying to angels, the praying to Mary. It starts about 375 AD, although there is some evidence of prayers to Mary about 250 to 300 AD. By the time you get to 431 AD, Mary is virtually being worshipped as the Mother of God. And it's by the time you get to 593 AD, purgatory is invented. It's never in the Bible. It's introduced at the time of Pope Gregory the Great. By 610 AD, the title Pope, the official title of Pope that is, was first given to the Bishop of Rome by the Emperor Phocas, but Gregory the Great rejected it because he thought it was pride. But Boniface III accepted it. As we move on, by 709 AD, a practice is introduced of kissing the Pope's feet as if he's an emperor. And then we find by 750 AD that the popes are starting to have temporal power. And we move on, 788. There is the adoration of the cross, and images are being prayed to, and relics are being adored as if they are, we're finding sort of a pagan idolatry coming in, which would later on really enrage the reformers of what they saw with these things. We find in 995 AD, we are seeing the canonization of dead saints by Pope John XV. Once we get into 1000 AD onwards, we're starting to see the Roman Catholic Mass becomes obligatory to everybody. By 1079, celibacy of priests became law by Pope Boniface VII. And then we get to 1090, the Rosary is introduced, which includes a regular praying to Mary. By the time you get to 1184, there's the Inquisition of the heretics by the Council of Verona. 1190, we see the sale of indulgences beginning, which was a real racket and a scam that was challenged by Martin Luther later on. We also find in 1215, transubstantiation becomes dogma under Pope Innocent III. That meant when the priest said the words in Latin, "This is my body," it was believed that the bread and the wine of the communion turned literally into the body and blood of Christ. And it would be this that the reformers would challenge, and many would be burnt at the stake as heretics. But it was clearly going beyond the scriptures, what was introduced. And then we find in 1220 is the adoration of the wafer, the worship of Christ in the communion wafer. By the time you get to 1229, the Bible is forbidden to be read by the layman, only by those who are qualified as priests, if they could read, that is. And this was the Council of Valencia. By the time you get to 1414, communion wine was forbidden to the laity by the Council of Constance. 1439, purgatory becomes fully dogma by the Council of Florence. By the time you get to 1545, the church tradition is on an equal footing with biblical authority. And we see this in the Council of Trent. And it will be this very thing that will be challenged by the reformers. They would say, no, church tradition must be under the authority of Scripture, not on an equal footing with Scripture. And by 1546, the apocryphal books are added to the Old Testament. Later on, in the future, you'd find the papal infallibility dogma was introduced in 1870 by Pope Pius IX. So we're seeing a church, sadly, which is rising up in power. It is decadent, it is corrupt. The Bible does no longer have the authority. It's the saying Rome knows best becomes the authority. You cannot challenge it, and if you do, you can be in serious trouble. So there's an extraordinary man called Columbanus from Ireland. He went and pioneered Christian communities in Switzerland, Italy, Germany, and parts of Europe. And he had a great influence, in fact, on the rise again of education and Christianity in those places where Christianity had dwindled so much. And as an Irish monk, he wrote a letter to Pope Gregory the Great at the beginning of the 7th century. He said, "The most beautiful head of the churches," this is how he addresses the Pope, "the most beautiful head of the churches of all Europe, the most sweet Pope, the supreme pontiff, the pastor of pastors, the venerable sentinel, watch, for the sea is in uproar. Vexed with death-bringing storm winds, watch, for the water has already entered the ship of the church, and she is in danger of sinking. Let us return to the book, which we left on the side." So, on the one hand, he's kind of elevating the Pope with these great titles, and he calls himself like a sort of a basic peasant. He's an Irish peasant. How can he address such a great person as the Pope? But on the other hand, he's saying the real issue is, in his last line I quoted, "Let us return to the book, let us return to the Bible, which was left on one side." And that's been the issue. The church authorities have put the Bible's authority on one side, and they had become the authority over the Bible. And the water of corruption was pouring into the church, and the church was in danger of sinking. And so that was the 7th century. And he says, if we only return to the Bible as the authority, that would mean then, of course, the papacy, the whole structure of the authority, the whole setup had grown and developed over centuries of the Roman Catholic Church would have to be challenged. And it would take a lot of brave people to do that. There was a famous scholar called Erasmus of Rotterdam in Holland. And he was a great Roman Catholic scholar. And he wrote in 1526, "The world had become bewitched by ceremonial. Evil monks reigned unchecked. Theology had been reduced to subtle sophistries, while bishops and priests acted like tyrants in the name of the Roman Pontiff or the Pope." So even though he remained within the Roman Catholic Church, he believed, as he was on his own pilgrimage, he was a scholar of the classics, but as he translated the Bible, he put it together, he got the Greek together, and began to call people back to the original Greek rather than the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. What was happening was that people were beginning to get back and to realize what the original scriptures were saying. And the more he looked, the more he investigated the Bible, the more he began to realize things need to be changed. But he hoped for a reformation within the Roman Catholic Church, that there'll be no split, no division. But eventually, as we educated the people, firstly with the authorities in the church, the priests, and the priests could educate the churches, they could come into a more biblical faith through the scriptures, a revival of the authority of the Bible. So he remained completely faithful to the Pope within the Roman Catholic Church. But of course, the simmering volcano was growing and growing in Europe, and people increasingly began to speak out and say we need to reform the church. And this would lead to division and the rising of the Protestant church in Europe, and of course the Presbyterian church in Scotland. And this would be our next part we'll look at. But the Reformation was totally needed, but it would come at great cost.